Hello my friends, this is episode 21 and it's called Medicine. The short but distant brush with modern civilization was all but forgotten the next day. It was to be replaced with a much closer encounter with the existing civilization right there in the rainforest jungle. Gus was chopping fresh root to grind down for more of the coffee, as he called it, when he called to Belle, who was preparing a soup. "We have visitors, Belle." This time 8 men approached the camp, and most of them Belle recognised from earlier visits. They walked up to Gus laughing and talking, and each in turn held his arms and said, "Gayat." Gus, thinking that this must be a greeting, took their arms and said, "Gayat." They found this amusing and pleasing. Belle, very pleased to see them, signalled for them to sit. 7 of them did, but the 8th, the same young man who had done so before, brought forth from his pouch a small dead monkey, skinned it and skillfully and gave it to Belle. "Thank you," she said. The local young man just smiled and then joined his companions. So soon all were sharing food, and through gestures the hunting party explained the floods had spread and they'd come in boats. The hunting was good in this area. Gus, who had become fascinated by these happy people now, wanted names. He put his hand on his chest and said, as before, "Gus." He pointed to Belle. She put her hand on her chest and said, "Belle." The oldest man of the 8 visitors put his hand to his chest and said, "Yukta." Then he pointed at the young man who had brought the monkey. The young man touched his chest and said, "Rukno." The old man walked to the young man and moved his hand back and forth between Rukno and himself, and both Gus and Belle rightly understood he was telling them that he, Yukta, was Rukno's father. By means of signs a reasonable conversation developed. The men signed that they'd hunted all morning but would return to their village soon. Gus addressed Yukta by name, pointed to the sky and brought his hand down in a motion like the crashing plane. Yukta understood and pointed in the direction of the wrecked aircraft. Gus then pointed at Belle and called her over. He showed the festering cut behind Belle's ear. His concerned look told Yukta all he needed to know. Yukta called another man over. He pointed to him, he put his hand to his chest and he said, "Kanyal." Belle gave Kanyal a smile and he examined her cut with all the care of an accident and emergency doctor in a city hospital. Kanya turned to Yukta and spoke quickly in a confident tone. He seemed to be telling Yukta what needed to be done. Yukta paused for a moment and then set his face close to Gus. He said, "Gus, Belle," and then made a gesture for them to come. He made paddling gestures and then put his hands over his eyes and then held up one finger. Gus wasn't sure what he meant. He understood that they would go with the men and to be taken through the water, but it was Belle who got the point of the hands over the eyes and one finger up. "I think Yukta is saying we should go with them and stay overnight." Belle is thrilled at the prospect of entering their community as guests, and the stinging pain in her head is evidence of the need for it to get attention. Soon the natives are on their feet. Yukta gestures for them to follow, and after closing the tent to try and keep insects out, the 2 immigrants go with the locals. They walk about half a mile back toward the earlier camp, but the land here is now very squelchy underfoot, and the water is clearly visible not too far away in among the trees. Skirting along the water's edge, they come on the canoes. These were not the kind of canoe both Gus and Belle had seen on the rivers of Europe, but there were 3 of them and they seemed to be a dugout made from a tree trunk, and the sides were crafted and shaped. Gus knew that if he'd been given a tree trunk he wouldn't have been able to turn out anything so nice as this. Inside the canoe there was a lining of what looked like some kind of tree bark. 3 men climbed in to 2 of the canoes, but Yukta and his son Rukno welcomed the Europeans into their canoe, and soon they were following the others across the flooded forest and into the river itself. They paddled for a short distance downriver. Here the river was about 30 yards wide, but as they turned round a bend they came onto a wider expanse of water. Maybe much of it was flooded land, but as they passed one marshy bank, Belle was a little alarmed when she saw what she first of all thought were logs that turned out to be something else. Rukno, sat at the back of the canoe, must have picked up her alarm. "Kanyak," he said with a smile, which when Belle turned round reassured her. If he wasn't worried, nor was she, and as they paddled a couple of miles upstream on this water, she could see caimans at 3 other places. She was glad she brought her notebook and was soon making rough drawings and notes. The flurry of brightly coloured parrots that flew across the water had her so excited that Ragnar and Gus joined together in laughing, a language that is international. Jukta, though, nearer to the front of the boat was paddling and concentrating like a bus driver in Birmingham. The other two canoes now turned at right angles and crossed to the other side of the water. It was then that Gus and Belle got their first taste of the village. Oh, what a sight! Just up on a bank above the river, quite high, were a half-dozen large thatched homes. The houses were built on piled platforms, obviously to protect them from the floods. There was one larger building. As the canoes were hauled up out of the water, Jukta gestured to Gus and Belle to join him, and they entered the small village. A baby was crying, and there was a smell of fish cooking nearby. Two small children were playing somewhere near to one of the huts, and Belle could scarcely make out the image of mother inside the hut, where it was dark, but like any mother, she seemed to have an eye on her young ones. Jukta called. Men and women with children also came out of the huts, mostly out of the larger hut. Belle recognised that there were more than 20 people here. They all stared at the two white-skinned people, and some started to laugh, good-naturedly. Jukta called them closer, and they gathered around. The men made what seemed to be the traditional greeting, taking Gus by the arms and saying, "Gayat." Gus took their arm in turn and repeated, "Gayat." The women gathered around Belinda, and the two toddlers pushed their way to the front. Belle bent down to their height and talked to the little boy and girl, who smiled, or grinned would perhaps be a better description. Jukta walked away to the men first, and they were obviously discussing something important. Gus watched with curiosity. Jukta seemed to be a main man here. Belle, in the meantime, was now holding the little girl up, and her mother was stroking Belle's white face, fascinated, and with a friendship face and manner. Belle had only just noticed how little the women were wearing, and she thought, if I found the dress of the men embarrassing, heaven help Gus here. The women were now chatting and smiling at Belle. She put the little girl down, but she cried, so she picked her up again. Jukta paused for a moment in his conversation, said something to the women who had been touching Belle's face. Then he paused and said, "Belle?" The women paused in her stroking and said, "Belle." Then tapping her own head, the woman in front of her pronounced, "Taliki." Belle repeated, "Taliki." The little girl was clinging to Belle, and she could see that the woman was pleased and that she was giving attention to the child. Taliki spoke to a young girl, a teenager, with very white teeth, and the girl came back with a bowl of liquid. Belle didn't have a clue what it was, but as Taliki indicated, she lifted it to her lips, trying not to drop it as she sipped it. She still didn't know what it was, but on a hot day in the rainforest, the cool, refreshing fruit juice is welcome, a gift. Taliki took the little girl from Belle so that she could concentrate on the drink. "Thank you, Taliki," she said. The girl worked out the expression as a word of gratitude and smiled, pleased that this strange white lady was comfortable using her name. Gus had disappeared. Belle wasn't worried. In his seemingly primitive village there was peace and a welcome worth anywhere else. The little girl went into the house and came back with a bundle of stems and leaves tied up with a cord and beads, and while Belle looked at it, she realised that this was some kind of Amazonian toy, maybe a doll. Gus, in the meantime, had gone with Jukta into the main building. The light inside was very gloomy. There were 3 fires glowing in different places, and the smell of wood smoke and fish was strong. But there was also a strong smell of perfume or spice. As Gus' eyes became more used to the light, he could see a much older man sitting closer to one of the fires. He had a bright face as the firelight caught it. He had beads around his head and at the front of his head, and a skin of some sort across his chest, and a pendant with stones and beads threaded together. On his wrists he had threads and other decorations, mostly wooden beads. Jukta signalled for Gus to stop where he was. He went forward to the older man and spoke in hushed tones. After a few minutes he beckoned Gus to join him, and the 3 men sat cross-legged near to the fire. The teenage girl who brought Belinda a drink came with bowls of drinks for the 3 men. The old man said something to the girl, and she laughed as she left the house. The men sipped, and the old man pointed to the sky and brought his hand down to show he knew Gus had crashed from the sky. His face had become serious, and he spoke to Jukta in a hushed whisper, but turned to look at Gus between sentences. Yukta rose and went to a corner of the house from where he brought several jars, highly decorated pottery. He then brought a large bowl. He carefully poured some liquid in it and added some white powder. He stirred it in until it was thick and honey-like. Then he added some dark powder. And Gus could smell something that he knew but couldn't place. He knew he'd met with that scent in the forest somewhere. Finally he watched as the old man took pinches of something from 4 different jars, 1 pinch of this, 3 of that, 2 of this, 1 of that, and 6 from that. He then stirred it up briskly. He looked old, but there was strength in his muscles yet. He lifted it on the stirring stick and watched as it fell like treacle back into the bowl. He repeated the process, stirring again, examining it on the stick. Now looking pleased, he placed the bowl on a flat stone and put it all on top of the glowing fire. He looked at Gus and pointed at his own head in the exact place where Belle's cut was at the back of her head. After about 10 minutes he lifted the bowl off with loose fingers and stirred it even more rapidly. He spoke to Yukta and he got up and collected 2 long leaves, dried leaves. He gave them to the older man, who sprinkled them over the mixture. Then he stirred it all again. The old man looked at Gus but said something to Yukta. He went outside and returned with Belle. Gus explained that this was the medicine man, the village doctor, and he had prepared something to heal her head. Are you happy with that, Belle? So, attention of the medical kind for Belinda at last. Thanks for continuing to listen to this story, my friends. Lots of love to you. Bye for now. Episode 22 to follow shortly. Bye.